Hello and welcome to our third session. Welcome to our third session series on AI, neuroscience, and architecture. I'm delighted to have as a guest here today David Chalmers, a very significant thinker within the world of philosophy. Before I introduce David, I want to just kind of briefly give a context to this, both in terms of this particular series we're doing, and also some of the other debates that we have been looking at in digital futures that kind of set the scene, as it were, for look at David Chalmers' work. Today we'll be looking at his recently released book, Reality Plus. So this is the series that we have. It's already had two of them so far. We have Joscha Bach next week, followed by Ben Bratton, Jeff Hawkins, Andy Clark. We haven't fully decided or fixed the schedule, and there are a number of other thinkers along the way, including Antonio Damasio, Susan Schneider, and Andy Clark, someone that Dave knows really well. This is part. All these are being uploaded onto our Digital Futures YouTube website, where they can access for free for everyone around the world. What we're trying to do here is to try and democratize education by making all these important ideas very freely available to architects and students, and indeed other related disciplines around the world. So here we have the link to the YouTube thing. I should also mention that we have a Farsi talk coming up this week. Tomorrow I'm doing one. It's going to be partially in Arabic, and next Saturday we have a session looking at ICT Stuttgart. So just to say something by way of context, the schedule today is we're gonna I'll say this, introduce as a background, introduce David. David will make a presentation, then we'll have questions. I will start in a kind of Lex Friedman style, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. But of course, we've had two series on architecture and philosophy, one of which we looked at Baudrillard, and particularly we looked at Baudrillard's discourse of simulation in the context of the matrix, something that is going to become central to our discussion today. And of course, as you know, his book Simulacra and Simulation was indeed part of the whole sort of the Matrix movie. Baudrillard refused to actually join to be part of the second take on the movie because he thought we misunderstood his work. We will maybe have a chance to see how that happened in some senses. So I was going to say also that over the years, I wrote a book back in '99. It came out looking at Baudrillard and hyperreality. And I think what he says about hyperreality is very interesting in the context of virtual reality. How can you somehow connect the two? And of course, for Baudrillard, we are in this condition that he's termed hyperreality, whereby we operate now in a world of images, totally marooned in hyperspace, as it were, without any contact to the real world. And he calls that world of reality, that world of images, our new reality or hyperreality. And he uses an architectural motif, as it were, to illustrate his point: Disneyland. Disneyland purports to be an imaginary kingdom set aside from the real world outside, but actually for Baudrillard, it's precisely it's a condensation of all the values of America. And as such, it becomes a prop, as he puts it, to the world outside. It makes us believe that it's real, but actually it's a hyper-real world in which we operate. This concept of hyperreality and virtual reality have always struck me as being very interesting in their own kind of way. And once we get into the metaverse, of course, we find that Disney's also there as well. More than just shopping, this virtual pop-up brings visitors into a world of joy and optimism. Well, there we go. I should also say that another person who is central to some of these debates at the background was Slavoj Žižek, whom we had in June. And Žižek famously has written an essay from virtual reality to the virtualization of reality, written some time back in 1998, I think it was. I reprinted it in Designing for a Digital World. And I think that the whole logic of his discourse, his kind of Lacanian discourse, offers an interesting take on this question, because it's not as though, in Baudrillard's terms, Baudrillard sees it as a progressive situation whereby the third order of simulation is almost historical fact in the 1980s. For Žižek, we were always, in some senses, removed. Fantasy becomes constitutive of what we call reality. We look at the world through the lens of fantasy. And also alongside that, Anil Seth has been writing a lot of has also had a certain take, shall we say, on the question of reality, that the way in which we look at the world through a form of controlled hallucination. So these figures will no doubt be coming into the debate. But to introduce David Chalmers, and it really is a great pleasure to be able to introduce Dave, someone I've long admired, and someone whose book, let me start off by saying this is a book. This is a book that is really going to appeal to architects. There's absolutely no question in my mind that I don't know who the intended audience was. We had a discussion about this, but in fact, it's actually perfect for architects. It explains a lot of very complex philosophical issues in a very clear way, very accessible fashion, and it is. I see it as a kind of greatest hits of some of David's work. A lot of the kind of ideas that he's explored over the years, the extended mind, the whole issue about consciousness and so on, and GPT-3, they're all in there. So just to say something about Dave's background, he was born in Sydney, in Australia, and grew up in Adelaide, the part of Australia where all the good wines come from. He then studied at the University of Adelaide, studied mathematics before going to Oxford to study on a Rhodes Scholarship to start a PhD in mathematics. I see Dave as someone who studied at Cambridge. I see Dave as being a kind of like the Oxford version of Wittgenstein, someone who's coming from the world of science and technology, shall we say, and turning towards philosophy. I see very straight parallel. Wittgenstein, of course, came from Austria to Cambridge, and Dave from Australia to Oxford. But he abandoned that, and he eventually ended up working on a PhD on the question of consciousness with Douglas Hofstadter, who of course is famous for the book Gödel, Joscha Bach, and he studied for a PhD alongside Melody Mitchell, someone who we've mentioned several times in these debates. And eventually, after and got his PhD, then moved on to a series of posts. Most famously, maybe the first one with Andy Clark, who we will see later on in this session, in this series, before eventually arriving at in NYU. But it is this book, in many ways, which really launched him into onto the world scene, based on his PhD. And the question of consciousness has become a constant refrain in all his work. He's written many books on this particular series. This is something that I give my students every year to look at, a TED Talk, very helpful TED Talk, where he describes this in a movie, as it were, going on inside your mind, describes what consciousness is, and also raises famously the hard problem of consciousness. Why do we have consciousness in the first place? And that's one of the ideas that's really that Dave is famous for. I have to mention this. The early versions of Dave Chalmers with the long hair and leather jacket were quite iconic, and he has his own band called the Zombie Blues. Although it seems there's only one song in that particular that's played. But I act like you act. I do what you do, but I don't know if it's like if so I can't see this. If what I don't know what it's like to be you, what consciousness is, I ain't got a clue. I got the zombie blues. And I should say the zombie is a theme in his work for describing what happens when you don't have consciousness. So today then we look at this book, and it was launched on the 25th of January. It's already become a bestseller. I would say I think every architect should really have a look at this book. The reason why I say this, Dave, is that we operate already to some extent in a virtual world. We, as architects, we don't make buildings. We actually prepare representations of buildings, drawings of buildings, models of buildings, and someone else constructs them. So we're already in that domain. In fact, in the 90s, the term virtual reality was used not for the kind of headgear, the goggles we have now, but just for simply the term of being on the computer itself. So it's absolutely central. I think that it lays out very clearly an argument that I would agree to for most parts, and I think it's highly relevant in just providing us with a tool to start thinking about virtual reality in a more serious way. I'm now going to stop sharing and hand over to introduce Dave. Dave, it's fantastic to see you. It's wonderful. My students will be watching this as well, and they've been listening to you the whole time, and I'm sure a lot of architects all over the world are. So it's wonderful to see you here. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Neil. It's great to be talking here to this group, an unusual group for me, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing your perspective on these issues. And if it turns out that the book is useful to architects, that would be amazing for me. Let me just share my screen. So I'm just going to give a brief summary of some themes in the book. I just got to change in background sound. Just make sure, Neil, you're just say something to make sure you can.
Yeah, I can. Yes, that's fine.
Okay, very good, no problem. Yeah, Neil just asked for a brief summary, maybe 10 or 20 minutes. Heavy on the pictures, so I thought I'd go heavy on the pictures. It's early in the morning here. It's 10 a.m. Sunday here. I'm still becoming conscious, even earlier when Neil is, I guess. For some of you, it's midnight. So I thought I'd go heavy on the pictures and an introduction to some themes in this book. This book is all about the philosophical analysis of virtual worlds. And I thought one way to illustrate some of the themes of the book is to peg it to two major virtual worlds in science fiction, the Matrix and the Metaverse. The Matrix basically represents the universe as a simulation. You know, the idea, could we ourselves be living in a simulation, sometimes called the simulation hypothesis, beautifully illustrated in the Matrix movies. And that hypothesis that we're in a simulation is some part of what the book explores, but also somewhat more practically and more down to earth is issues tied to the metaverse. The Metaverse, I mean, the name was introduced by Neil Stephenson in his '92 novel Snow Crash, and of course, famously, Mark Zuckerberg has recently got behind it in a big way. And I guess the Metaverse is coming to mean something like the coming ecosystem of virtual worlds that we will actually use and spend a huge amount of time in. So the Matrix is the hypothesis we're already in a virtual world. The Metaverse stands for the virtual worlds that we're actually increasingly going to use. And the book kind of spends basically a fair amount of time on each of these, but to put it together, as a philosopher, I like to define some terms. So a virtual world is just an interactive computer-generated world. They needn't be immersive. A virtual reality has to be immersive. You experience it through a headset, but a virtual world needn't be that way. So yeah, what Neil was saying was called a virtual reality in the 90s would here count as a virtual world because it's at least if it's interactive and computer generated. Here we go. So here's the virtual world of Second Life, for example. Huge 15 years ago, still going today. It's not a full-scale virtual reality because people don't experience it with a headset. It's just on a 2D screen. Nonetheless, it's a very rich computer-generated world in which people have very rich experiences. They build relationships, they build communities. Some people work there, they play there. So yeah, it's turned out to be difficult to port this to virtual reality because of the frame rate. But there's a gradual switch coming. It's a gradual evolution coming towards virtual reality. All right, let's see if here we go. Virtual reality, which I define as an immersive, interactive, computer-generated world, adding the all-important condition of immersiveness. You experience these worlds from the inside, three-dimensionally, as if you were there, present at the center. And that's the kind of experience that a virtual reality headset, here the Oculus Quest 2, will give you, and it's becoming increasingly popular. The pandemic seems to have given this a boost, and yeah, Mark Zuckerberg seems to have gone all in behind this virtual world technology now. Here's people playing Beat Saber, slicing cubes in VR. Here is a social virtual world, VR chat, which, you know, one of the worlds trying to be the Second Life of virtual reality. Still, no world here has become definitive. But I think, you know, when people say people used to say, I'm trying to create a metaverse, meaning I'm trying to create a single virtual world, which will be kind of dominant, where everyone will hang out. Somehow now this term is switching to mean an ecosystem of virtual worlds, something like the immersive internet is what people now mean by the metaverse. But a large part of it will be these virtual worlds in which people socialize, work, play, and so on. Also worth mentioning, augmented reality technology, where you experience the physical world, but you also experience virtual objects in the middle of the virtual world, made famous through Pokemon Go, but becoming more and more ubiquitous through this glasses form factor that many people think is probably the future of the metaverse. So anyway, this book is all about thinking philosophically about virtual worlds and about virtual reality, using philosophy to shed light on the technology, and also using the technology to shed light on the philosophy through a process I call techno-philosophy, basically a two-way interaction between technology and philosophy. And my central thesis, just to simplify, is virtual reality is genuine reality. There's a long tradition of holding that virtual reality is somehow fake or fictional or illusory or a hallucination or second class. What I want to say is, in principle, it need be none of those things. Virtual reality is genuine reality, at least it can be genuine reality, on a par, different from physical reality. It's a form of digital reality, quite different from ordinary physical reality, but no less real for all that. Just two different forms of reality, both genuinely real. And that breaks down into three different sub-theses, all of which play a big role in the book. First, virtual reality is not an illusion or a fiction. Yeah, what happens in virtual reality really happens. The objects you encounter in VR really exist. They're digital objects and digital events, but no less real for all that. Being made of bits is not a way of being less real than being made of atoms. Second, we can lead a meaningful life in virtual reality. In principle, life in VR can be as full of meaning. What happens there really can matter to you. You can build projects, you can build communities, you can struggle with oppression, you can have amazing achievements. In principle, as conscious beings, we have this ability to invest our worlds with meaning. And I think we can do that as well in principle with virtual worlds as with non-virtual worlds. Third, we might actually be in to bring it back to the simulation hypothesis, we might actually be in a virtual reality already. Maybe partly because, the possibility that we're in, say, a computer simulation, which would be indistinguishable from a physical reality. And even if we're not in a computer simulation, there was that nice quote from Zizek that Neil mentioned, the virtualization of the one true reality. The lesson of virtual reality is even ordinary reality is kind of virtual. One way that could happen is through it being a simulation, but also modern physics also tends to suggest a view of physical reality where it's not unlike virtual reality. So these are my three central theses in the book, just to say a little bit more about each of them tied into the matrix and the metaverse. I'll start with the last one. We might be in virtual reality already. And one version of this is the idea that we could be living in a giant computer simulation, such as the Matrix. For some reason, I'm losing control over my slides here. There we go. Okay, here's a scene from the Matrix. This is the Oracle and Trinity talking to each other, both hanging out in this giant simulation, the Matrix. The Oracle and Trinity are actually interestingly different. Trinity is a biological creature plugged in to the simulation. The Oracle is a machine, herself a creature of the simulation. So Trinity is what I call a biosim, biology connected to a simulation. The Oracle is a pure sim, illustrated here by the brain and the computer. This is two different ways of being in a simulation, both of which I think are open hypotheses for us now. I could be a biosim, a brain connected to a simulation. I could be a pure sim. All this could be could be simulated. And this is wonderful for a philosopher because it's a kind of an up-to-date illustration of ideas that go back to, well, ancient Chinese philosophy. Zhuangzi saying, am I a Zhuangzi who just dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he's Zhuangzi? Or here's Descartes sitting by his fire. Descartes in his Meditations from 1640 says, look, I seem to be just here sitting by the fire with a paper in my hand and a dog at my feet and so on. But how do I know any of that is actually happening? And here we have a modern illustration of that. Well, actually, it turns out Descartes is in VR, and the paper, the fire, the dog, all of that was just produced by the VR. So VR technologies has provided a way of making these Cartesian challenges, somewhat more realistic. Here's a more futuristic version of. Well, I thought I was going to have a version with the brain in a vat, but here we go. The brain in a vat. Very good. So here's Descartes' evil demon running the simulation. Descartes said, how do I know an evil demon isn't fooling me into thinking that there's a world out there when none of it is real? And here we have the evil demon using high-tech technology to produce this impression for the brain, which still gets to think, I think, therefore I am. I know that I exist, but does the rest of the world exist? Anyway, so in the first part of the book, I argue that we can't rule out the simulation hypothesis, that it could be. I don't say we are all in a simulation, but it's certainly consistent with all of our evidence. But it's kind of a bad news, good news story. Bad news, we might be in a simulation. Good news, simulations are actually a form of reality, on my view. This is contrary to a very common view that computer simulations are illusions, virtual reality is illusory reality. I want to say computer simulations are genuine reality. Even if we are in a simulation, and I could be, all this is still real. The cats, the dogs, the tables and chairs, the people, the planet, all these things are real. They're digital creatures, but no less real for all that. Here is Cornel West expressing I think the common view that if you're in a simulation, it's an illusion, because Cornel West himself appeared in the movies as Counselor West of Zion, who I'm thinking was originally in the Matrix, got out to Zion, then comes out to US where he's Cornel West, and then Cornel West says, but it's illusions all the way down. Maybe even this one is an illusion, as suggested by the wires there on the left. So this is great for a philosopher because it raises so many deep questions about reality, illustrated by another illustration from the Matrix. Neo says, this isn't real. And Morpheus says, what is real? How do you define real? And I would argue that even if we're in a digital simulation, objects in the simulation count as just as real as objects in a physical world. They're out there, independent of us. They make a difference. They have causal powers in the world. They exist, and they needn't be illusions. So that's something I try and argue in the book. Here's a picture I think this picture kind of sums up my vision for the book, that digital reality is genuine reality. You can really create genuine worlds using computer simulations, using VR technology. This is a vision of this picture actually represents God creating the universe, and but here God is a teenage hacker in the next universe up, and she's programming a computer. God says, "Let there be bits," and a whole reality spurs into existence, a genuine reality. Here's another picture of it. There's a traditional God on the left, a relatively traditional one, who creates a physical reality, but one that's made of bits. This is the so-called "it from bit" idea. Objects in reality are made of bits, and God creates the bits, and the tables and chairs are made of the bits. On the right, we have the simulator doing very much the same thing, programming a computer, arrange the bits, and then if that's what happened to us, then by arranging these bits, the simulator brought tables and chairs and trees and dolphins and so on into existence. So reality in a computer simulation, reality may be made of bits, but it's no less real for all that. It's just, this is kind of, I like this because it's like a creation myth for the information age. This is how gods do their work. They don't say, let there be lights. They say, let there be bits. Okay, so that's the matrix part. We could be in a simulation, but even if we are, it's still perfectly real. Now I want to bring that down to earth to somewhat more practical concerns tied to the coming technology of virtual reality and the so-called metaverse. Neil Stephenson's metaverse was like a single virtual world. Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse is an interconnected ecosystem of virtual worlds, maybe the immersive internet. Unlike the Matrix, it's when you're in virtual worlds these days, you're in a virtual world and you only go in there for a while and then you leave. But still, there's a certain continuity of the ideas. Oh, here's a rather dystopian illustration of the metaverse. Here, this is the metaverse, the 21st century version of Plato's cave. Many of you will know Plato's cave. How do we know we're not prisoners? We could be prisoners chained inside a cave, looking up and just seeing shadows of reality on the cave wall. If you're down on virtual reality, you could say, okay, VR does the same thing. Here we're just prisoners in the metaverse. We're prisoners in the cave, looking at the VR headsets. And there's Mark Zuckerberg up there running the show off his laptop. So this is the dystopian vision of the metaverse with chained inside VR headsets. Here's a rather more less dystopian version. This is Andy Clark here depicted in augmented reality, using augmented reality for all kinds of useful information to identify the people around him, to look his favorite restaurants, local train timetable, personal data, planning, and so on, all presented through his augmented reality glasses, which is what many people think is going to be the central form factor for the metaverse quite soon. And here this is actually an instance of what Neil mentioned, the extended mind. This technology has the capacity to extend our minds. The VR glasses will take over things from our visual system or from our recognition system. It'll recognize people for us. My smartphone is already taking over various memory functions, navigation functions, planning functions, and VR and augmented reality are going to do this all the more. And all the same issues come up for the coming headset and glasses technology. Is the world presented to you through VR and AR real, or is it an illusion? I want to argue that it needn't be an illusion, that you can have, there are real digital objects out there in a virtual world, and you can have accurate perception of those objects. The virtual worlds that we deal with, even from inside a VR headset, are perfectly real, and it's possible for you to have illusions there, but these are actually genuine realities you're inhabiting. And then the question arises, can you lead a meaningful life inside these virtual worlds? Here's another slightly dystopian vision from the philosopher Robert Nozick, who said, would you be willing to just step inside an experience machine that gives you all these wonderful experiences, maybe of being a successful Harvard professor and winning book awards, and so on. And Nozick said, surely we wouldn't want to do that, because all this would be a giant illusion. And actually, I think the experience machine, as Nozick presents it, maybe dystopian in this fashion, because it's all somehow pre-programmed and pre-scripted. But I think a genuine virtual world needn't be like that. And already in worlds like Second Life, people can exert autonomy, make choices, build relationships, build communities. And I would argue that in principle, the two can be on a par. Here, this is illustrated by a choice between entering an amazing virtual reality world. You get in this thing, and then you hang out in this virtual world where you can do amazing things like fly, or a terraform reality world. You get to go to a distant planet. Maybe we've terraformed some distant exoplanet, and we get to go there and live physically in a physical reality. I want to say these two in principle, there are some advantages to virtual reality, some advantages to terraform reality, but it's a rational choice to choose either. You can have meaningful, equally meaningful experiences both ways. So that's the third plank in virtual reality, is genuine reality. You can live a meaningful life in VR. Life may be good or it may be awful, but the full scale of human experience is available. I'm not predicting it's a utopia. It's going to be a utopia. I'm also not predicting it's going to be a dystopia. I think you can find elements of both. Utopian, VR can give us new bodies. I mean, especially, it's already been especially important, I think, for disabled people who can experiment with new forms of embodiment, people exploring new forms of gender expression, and so on. There's wholly new forms of experience. You can live in virtual worlds with entirely different laws of physics, teleportation, flying, instant communication around the world. Near unlimited space in virtual reality throws up some possibilities in a crowded Earth. Space in VR is cheap. Also, virtual abundance, material goods in virtual reality are cheap too. You know, a house is easy to duplicate, to make another house, much more than in physical reality, which opens interesting possibilities for equality and social justice. At the same time, of course, there are many potential dystopian elements. These virtual worlds are, right now, most of them are corporatocracies, totally governed by corporations. You know, the likes of, and the coming virtual worlds look like they're going to be run by corporations like Meta, like Google and Apple, like Microsoft, and so on. Do we really want the worlds that we live in, spend a huge amount of time in, to be fully controlled by corporations? I mean, if you think the privacy and manipulation issues are big in social media right now, when it's just, you know, your newsfeed, wait till these corporations are controlling the world around you in potentially all-powerful, all-knowing ways. Of course, there's going to be issues about what kinds of equality of access will there be to virtual worlds. It's very easy to predict that all the forces of power, domination, and inequality in the physical world will extend to the virtual world. Not to mention that, you know, we can't neglect the physical world. In promoting virtual reality, I'm in no sense saying abandon physical reality. Virtual reality is always going to be grounded in the physical world. So anyway, so there are utopian, dystopian elements. I guess I would like to think that, you know, just as the internet, for example, has brought the internet has brought amazing things, it's brought awful things. I'd like to think the net balance has been positive. I would hope that the same could end up being true of the metaverse. It'll bring amazing things and awful things, but there's at least some chance that the net balance could be positive anyway. So to summarize, virtual reality is genuine reality. The rest is up to us. Thanks.
Great, super clear. Thank you so much, Dave. I've got some bigger questions, but I want to ask a very quick question first of all. So just for everyone else to say, I'm going to ask a few questions, Lex Friedman style, and then we're going to go up to everyone else, both on Zoom and on the live stream. So please send your questions in. Yes, I buy the argument about virtual reality being, as it were, a kind of real reality, we could say, maybe. But what the question I want to ask is how would you, if you say that virtual reality is a kind of reality, do you not take the line that artificial intelligence is a form of intelligence as well? Is that a necessary corollary of what you're saying?
I do, actually. I think the two theses are separable, and this book focuses somewhat more on there's the mind side of the equation and the world side of the equation. I think of philosophy as being all about understanding the mind, understanding the world, understanding the relation between them. The focus of my previous work has been more on the mind. The focus of this book is more on the world, but the mind definitely comes up along the way. I think at one point I'd say if I was to have a fourth thesis that fleshed out this thesis that virtual reality is genuine reality, it would be the thesis that virtual minds are genuine minds. Or actually, to bring in the extended mind thesis, virtual and augmented minds are genuine minds. That augmented reality technology genuinely extends the mind. Ultimately, AI technology can support conscious minds. So yeah, I do hold that. And one section of the book is on mind. I argue for those theses. Just say you didn't accept that. Just say, somebody thought that only a biological creature could have a mind. Brains have minds, silicon systems don't. I think they could still accept quite a lot of what I say in the book. For example, the idea that when you, as a biological creature, are using virtual reality, that's still a genuine reality for you. Or maybe in the brain in the vat situation, the brain in the vat would be experiencing, a full-scale universe when they're in a simulation. Where they'd have to get off the boat would be that, for example, remember the illustration with the Trinity and the Oracle? So Trinity, on this view, will be genuinely conscious, experiencing a full-scale world. The Oracle presumably won't be, because she's a machine. If you think machines can't be conscious, then that will be out. So on this view, the hypothesis that we're in a pure simulation and we are ourselves machines will be ruled out as impossible. That's if you hold that view associated with people like John Searle, that consciousness is biological. So that's just to say you could accept my thesis that virtual reality is genuine reality and accept the corresponding. You can accept my thesis about the world and and reject my thesis about the mind. That said, I think the two theses do go very naturally together. So I don't mind seeing them in some sense as part of a broader package of virtual reality across the board, and mind and world is genuine reality. Or I guess artificial minds are genuine minds, artificial worlds are genuine worlds.
Yeah, just to follow up from that, I mean, one of the comments I made in my own writing is that you can go from the extended mind thesis to the extended intelligence thesis. Increasing now in AI circles, it's not AI versus humans, but AI as a kind of supplement to human intelligence. That seems to be the discourse at the moment.
Yeah, well, people talk about artificial intelligence and intelligence augmentation, AI and IA, and there is of course many of the uses of AI right now are being used precisely to augment human intelligence. So intelligence augmentation is huge. At the same time, there's also, of course, a huge wave of interest in developing artificial general intelligence, which is often thought of as developing autonomous intelligences. And what's the latest thing just to be released? AlphaCode, the machine which writes code for you. Well, right now, that could be an aid just to a programmer. That's intelligence augmentation, or it could ultimately be a replacement for programmers once it's good enough, in which case it's full scale AI. So I think both are going to be extremely important.
Maybe I can come back to the question of AGI in a second, but I wanted to just raise the I guess there are two models that are out there. When you describe the matrix through kind of Baudrillard, that kind of logic, you describe it as a distant cousin of the technological, the metasphere, and so on. I guess when we had this discussion about Baudrillard, we picked up on the fact that Baudrillard criticized the matrix because for him there is no way out, whereas the matrix, potentially you can choose the red pill or the blue pill. You potentially could get this way out. Maybe I'll just put that throw that out there for the moment. Is that fair to think that Baudrillard is we are locked in this? There's no escape from that. Whereas potentially the matrix can offer you a way out.
Yeah, well, in the book I distinguish between perfect and imperfect simulations. A perfect simulation will be indistinguishable from physical reality across the board, indistinguishable from the world it's simulating. And if we're in a perfect simulation, there'll be no red pills, because in physical reality, let's say the original one, there's no such thing as a red pill that takes you to the next universe up, at least unless it's simulations all the way up. But let's set that possibility aside. So, but on the other hand, in a perfect simulation, no red pills. But on the other hand, in an imperfect simulation, there'll be glitches. Maybe the simulators will sometimes communicate with us, and maybe there'll be devices like red pills by which we can leave the simulation. Actually, many virtual worlds right now are imperfect in this way. There's very direct communication between the virtual world and the next world up. People enter virtual worlds from the outside, communicate. Certainly a biological player inside a virtual world can take a red pill and go outside. I don't know. It's a bit more complicated for the pure simulated creatures, like a non-player character in a video game. If you wanted to, you could give them a red pill and embody them in a little robot body, say, in the physical world. So yeah, I think both kinds of simulations are are important. I mean, the perfect simulation is kind of a pure and pristine philosophical case, which is why it's interesting. It may have also be why Baudrillard was interested in that case. But I actually find the imperfect simulation super interesting as well. And the matrix, I guess, is definitely reflecting an imperfect simulation.
Yeah, just to pick up on that question a bit further, one of the issues that came up last week with Blaise Aguera y Arcas, who's one of the AI experts at Google, well, I'm sure you know him, and also comes up in the work of Jeff Hawkins and I think Joscha Bach and so on, the idea that we're modeling the world inside our brain already. In other words, we are operating in a model already. And I think that to some extent is kind of Anil Seth's position that the brain is locked into this bony skull. We don't know what's out there. We just have to kind of guess, as it were. So there is another line that can be taken to say that we're already in a simulation inside the brain itself.
It's interesting. Yeah, the brain certainly is quite good at generating simulations, even full-scale simulations. Every night when we dream, we're interacting with a simulation generated by our brains. When we imagine, we're to some considerable extent interacting with a simulation generated by our brains. In ordinary perception, I don't know. I mean, I agree with Anil and others. There's a very strong top-down component in perception. On the other hand, there's also a very strong bottom-up component in perception. So that the model that we interact, I agree that when we perceive the world and act on the world, we're dealing with the model. But in that case, I think the model is a big mix of bottom-up elements from the outside, as well as internally generated elements. For that reason, I think it's a little bit unlike, I mean, it's not an exact match for, say, the Matrix or even for dreams, because those don't have, because external reality really is playing an essential role. And I think I find this term controlled hallucination potentially misleading, because it tends to suggest it's all internally duplicated instead of what's actually true, which is a big mix of the top down and the bottom up. But I'm not sure you'll find an autonomous simulation in an autonomous model here, which is kind of, dreams, hallucinations, imagination, some of the inner worlds generated in, say, schizophrenia and so on, sometimes can have this property of being bringing in external inputs as well, but quite often they're internally generated. And actually in the book, one of my criteria for reality is being independent of the mind. So insofar as you are living in a simulation, like say a dream, which is fully generated by the mind, I'll say it's on a par in some respects, but because it's dependent on the mind, it maybe doesn't get to count as quite so fully real as simulations generated, say, by computers, which are out there independent of ourselves and not merely constructed by ourselves. So maybe one degree less reality for these kinds of internally generated simulations.
So the big issue is kind of, I think, AGI in some ways. I mean, I'm fascinated by that idea, and of course, some people would say that as Anil Seth says, you don't necessarily have to have consciousness. I mean, there's a difference between the kind of being sentient and greater computing power, and maybe anyway. But let me just pick up on the question though of the possibilities of getting towards that. I'm particularly intrigued by your GPT-3 interaction, which maybe I could just kind of briefly share the screen to point out what happened in terms of this. To begin with, the amazing interview, which is so let me just briefly say this is something that was done by GPT-3, natural language processing, the huge thing, which is at some level actually quite convincing. So this is an interview, and for those who don't know, maybe I'll spoiler alert: Dave is not Dave, but GPT-3. And what is, I think, astonishing is the level at which, or how convincing, in a way, GPT-3 is in answering these questions. I mean, I'm sure there are examples where it's not convincing, but this particular interview is actually disturbing. And it's only at the bottom, when you get to it, that you actually find out that Dave is not David Chalmers, but GPT-3 itself, and so on. But then there's this comment which you make yourself, which I always find very interesting, that the fact that I'm sorry, that GPT-3 is showing hints of general intelligence. I've always wanted to ask this question. What do you mean exactly by hints in that comment?
Oh, I guess just that GPT-3 seems to be quite good at many different things. Standardly, the AI systems we're familiar with are very good, but specialized on something like, say, game playing or recognition or planning or storytelling or something. GPT-3 is actually quite good at a whole lot of things. People have used GPT-3. I mean, it's most obviously good, good at carrying on something like a conversation, or maybe acting as kind of a chatbot, answering queries. But you can get GPT-3 to do things like write code. It'll write programs for you, quite well. People have combined GPT-3 with image technology, so it could recognize pictures, generate appropriate images. So this is getting towards the territory that people have called general intelligence. General intelligence basically means being intelligent at a lot of things. And yeah, GPT-3 is getting good at a lot of things. I said hints because, okay, there's still a lot of things it can't do very well. And even the things it does, it doesn't necessarily do amazingly well. It's not at superhuman levels and in most things. But yeah, but nonetheless hints. And for me, GPT-3 was kind of eye-opening, because now suddenly it seems, gosh, there's a possible path here to human level general intelligence. I mean, GPT-3 is not there, but by the time GPT-5 or 6 comes along, who's to say? I mean, either it'll be getting close, or it will start bringing into harsher relief the special sauce that we still need to get to human level intelligence. And now just seeing the more impressive things that GPT style systems have done in the last year or two, seeing AlphaCode, which was just released, which is showing amazing, close, not far from human level abilities at writing programs to solve mathematical problems. I still think it's going to turn out there are some big obstacles between here and AGI, but compared to, say, 30 years ago when I was in Hofstadter's AI lab in graduate school, just the idea of human level AI, people said a year spent working in artificial intelligence was enough to make you believe in God, because the AI systems were just so far away in every respect from human level intelligence. I don't think you can say that anymore. A lot of the barriers have been knocked down, and yeah, look, it could be another 5 years, it could be another 50 years, but I'd say that goal is now in sight in a way it just wasn't even 10 years ago, 2012. No one would have said that goal is in sight. Now I think there's a sense in which it's in sight, which doesn't tell us near distance, middle distance, far distance, but in some sense in sight.
What I picked up in your book is that your approach to AGI is the difference between AI and AGI is that AI is focused on one task, AGI can do many tasks, as you just said now. But for other people, I guess the key question is AGI means AI with that is sentient, with consciousness. Is that do you see GPT-3 heading in that direction?
Yeah, so there's like human level AGI. People do sometimes, I think the G means general, but then people do sometimes incorporate an H in there for human level, and maybe CI for conscious. I think few people would say that right now GPT-3 is conscious. Certainly not conscious in the way that humans are. I mean, I'm not totally unsympathetic to the idea that there's some element of consciousness in all information processing, in which case GPT-3 could have some consciousness too. But if it does, it's probably going to be a very simple and alien form of consciousness, nothing like a human. But once you get AI systems which are really operating at the human level of intelligence, my own view is that at that point it's reasonable to think that they have consciousness as well, especially if they start telling us about their conscious states and saying, oh yeah, well, I'm actually experiencing all this right now, and yeah, I know I'm really just a set of silicon circuits, but I feel like so much more if AI systems started talking like that to me and it wasn't just like programmed in, I'd start to think, okay, we have to start really taking seriously the idea there's consciousness there.
I mean, the discussion we had last week with Blaise was the idea that maybe that what we do as humans, we're not always fully conscious of. I mean, we were talking about Melanie Mitchell's comment that that the AI can't be creative because to be creative, you have to be conscious that you're being creative. And my point was actually there are many things that we do that we're not simply not conscious of. Even the kind of light bulb moment when you kind of something comes into your mind. I mean, afterwards, I think you do have to be, aware of it and conscious of it in order to appraise it and say that's a great idea. But when it actually erupts in the mind, I would question whether everything is fully sentient.
Oh, there's no question. Consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg in cognitive processing. How much information is there in my consciousness? Now, rather limited amount. How much is there in my brain? A huge amount, and yeah, vast amounts get done without consciousness, and that's often more efficient. And yeah, we save consciousness for the things we need to be able to, in principle, pay attention to and process in special ways. So yeah, that does raise the possibility that there could be a fully unconscious AI system that just took the unconscious systems without the conscious systems. And that's if you wanted to develop AI that didn't raise, say, the ethical, social issues of having conscious AI would have, maybe that would be a path to pursue. I'm rather skeptical that you could have a being that's human level but lacking consciousness entirely. Well, one thing people sometimes talk about is building oracle AI or tool AI that basically doesn't ever do anything. It just answers questions for you. It's a bit like Google Maps. If I want to get there, it'll tell me how to get there. I say, well, I want to do this. What's the best way to do this? Maybe if it's just a tool like that rather than an agent, people have speculated that perhaps then it wouldn't really be a conscious agent itself. It would just be a kind of a unconscious tool. I'm a little bit skeptical about that. I think even to be able to do that very well, it's entirely possible. There'd be some element of consciousness.
I want to ask some questions, to get some questions in from the audience, both from the Zoom audience and from the YouTube live stream audience. Maybe you could send in those questions. Before I move on, though, I want to just quickly show you what's happening using GPT-3. This is, you're probably aware of CLIP and DALI. Well, CLIP has been used alongside VQGAN to hallucinate these kind of scenes. The technique uses prompts, and you have a pre-prompt and then you have a prompt. In this case, the pre-prompt was the work of three very progressive architects, very kind of Zaha Hadid-like, shall we say, progressive architects. And then the prompt was futuristic Indian temple. And this is the kind of stuff that is appearing. This is the work of Giovanna Palacca, one of our digital futures team, which is making this world incredibly accessible. I mean, I don't know when GPT-4 is coming out, but it seems like this is really opening up and without having to, well, I mean, this is a kind of accessible way that architects have been hallucinating images and things using on the basis of GPT-3. So let me stop sharing now and let's go to, I want to start off, there's a question from Matt Gorbey. I want to ask Matt if he can possibly ask it himself, if you don't mind, Matt. Can you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, David, and thank you so much for this. It's extraordinary, and the book is so, it opens so many questions. One question that kept occurring to me throughout the book as I was reading it, in particular, when you're talking about the simulation hypothesis, there seems to be a sort of a binary between the natural world and the digital world. You talk about bio versus sims, and you talk about it from bit. And then if the question is, are we living in a simulation? Could we possibly be living in a simulation now? The supposition in reading that is that it would be a digital simulation that's created to make us think that the world is made of molecules, et cetera. And I kept kind of struggling with that and thinking, well, I mean, aren't bits and molecules and quarks and these sorts of things just words we use to describe whatever the smallest piece is? And I'd love your comments on that. I mean, isn't there sort of like, couldn't it actually be that nature is the simulation, not that we are simulating nature, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, and it probably is continuous in various ways. I mean, one interesting case here is just a kind of a pure it from bit view, where physics is ultimately digital. So we've got molecules made of atoms, made of quarks, we've got our string theory, whatever, and just say underneath all that is a digital level. But let's say now, if that digital level was created by a simulation, let me say, okay, now we're in a version of the simulation hypothesis. If it was created by a simulator, but just say it's like that, not created by a simulator, then is it? I would say yes, then it's digital, it's it from bit. No, it's not a computer simulation because it's not created by a simulator. And so that could, for example, be a intermediate case. And just say that we as biological creatures are ultimately made of bits, then you could hook up someone like me to a simulation and you'd have a digital simulation connected to a digital biological being. So I guess the key questions, I guess, to make this substantive is, one is there a digital level at some point? You know, one view could be biology and just analog all the way down and have no digital level there, which corresponds to what most people, I think right now. So if it goes that way, then reality isn't really digital, it's analog.
I guess the place. Oh, sorry. I guess the place I was going with it is just like, how do we know that the computer that we create that will simulate that will create the perfect simulation won't be actually a biological computer? I mean, how do we know that as we go into quantum computing, et cetera, we don't create that one from biology?
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I actually entertain this possibility in the book. I say that doing it digitally is really that's just a first pass. The bit is the simplest version of information here, but it could actually be qubits, or at one point I say it could actually be reals, like continuous analog computation. And once I start bringing in that as a version, say, of the simulation hypothesis, then I can no longer use digitality as a relevant criterion, because we can have non-digital simulation. So I guess what I'd say is, substantively, there are two different ideas here. One is the idea that reality could be at some level digital. The other one is the idea that reality could be at some level created as a simulation within some other world. And you can have those without the other. You can have digital without a simulation by having, say, a pure from bit world without a simulator. But you could also have a simulation without it being digital. Maybe someone in the next universe up created our world on an analog computer in their world, or on a quantum computer in their world. And so we're still a simulation. So those two ideas, the core idea, the most familiar version of the idea is both digital and a simulation. But then you can take those, you can keep just digital, just a simulation, or you can get rid of both. And then you say, okay, now we have a non-simulated analog reality that maybe corresponds to how we originally thought about reality. But if you also think that after going through this journey, even non-simulated analog reality starts to look a little bit virtual, then I'm with you.
Okay, thank you.
So just to say that Matt is in Canada right now. He works with Philip Beasley, who on interactive systems, immersive interactive systems, which are quite beautiful. Matt's also doing the DDES at FIU. I want to move on now to there are two questions. One from Andre Radman, who just makes a comment, but I'd like to also invite Victoria Barbo to also add to that question. So Andre, who's unable to open up his screen, is VR is real, but it's ocular-centric. No. Hence, the full scale of experience may not be available. That's his question. And then on top of that, maybe I could ask Victoria to maybe add another refrain onto that question. Victoria, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, hi. Can you guys hear me? Yes. I'm unable to share my video, but I will gladly ask my question. And that was kind of in response to what Andre was posing as a thought. And I was kind of following the thought of embodied and inactive mind in the tradition of Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Uexküll, and many others. And I'm kind of like, kind of examining the schism that kind of is created between body and mind and body and world. And I would like to ask you to maybe illuminate us a little bit more about your position about the role of the body and the kind of embeddedness, because as Andre said, VR is kind of right now very focused on the ocular sense, so the visual sense. And yeah, I would like to kind of see what your response to that is. Isn't VR kind of leaving out the full scale of human experience? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, these are totally fair questions, especially when it comes to VR as it is right now. I guess it's audio visual, and the audio is not bad either. But where most of the concentration has been on the visual, and to some extent on the auditory, and where it massively falls down, of course, is the bodily senses, all the different bodily senses, whether it's touch or proprioception or hunger and thirst or sex, human contact. It just totally, current VR totally falls down on all of these dimensions. Actually, yesterday I had lunch. A journalist asked me if I would like to have lunch in VR with them for some features. So we actually had to figure out how you actually eat in VR, which of course is not really something you can do in any satisfactory way right now. We ended up sort of going through the motions of eating some virtual sushi while in the physical world also consuming some physical sushi. But of course, that's cheating. That's not really eating in VR, because the body, just human bodily functions are mostly not available in VR as it stands. Now, what there are, I think, nonetheless, avatars are rather impressive, and you can do some very impressive things with avatars, which are digital bodies. You mostly don't have the standard bodily senses, but people do, I think, find elements of, say, proprioception with avatars, a sense of where your body is in space. Actually, many video games, people use vision to give you a bit of proprioception. I gather a lot of people who play first-person shooters, typically, you've got the option of having the perspective just from the, seeing everything from the perspective of your eyes, but many people prefer to have a perspective just behind their body, so they can see their body, and that gives them an analog of proprioception, which some people experience apparently as a somewhat bodily sense. So I think even without human level bodily functions, I think you can still get some of the roles of the human body can be played with current avatars, and the avatars can kind of serve as, at the very least, as some kind of extension of your body or a substitute digital body, but with maybe a highly impoverished one. Then, of course, the other question is, what about the long term? Will we be able to get genuine embodiment in the long term, and the bodily senses inside VR in the long term? By the way, it's also worth mentioning that many people have this strong sense of attachment even to a virtual body, and that bodily assaults, for example, can be very traumatic for people in virtual reality, indicating that there's at least a sense of bodily identification that plays a major role, even for current limited VR, to the point where Meta just had to announce that in their virtual world Horizon, they're going to impose 4 foot ceilings around. People are going to be able to get, avatars will be able to get no closer than 4 feet to each other by default to prevent this kind of thing. But long term, what might be possible? I mean, people are certainly working on the bodily senses, whether it's the haptics industry or the remote sex industry and so on. But it is, of course, very primitive right now. In the longer term, what's possible? I guess one stage will be when we have brain-computer interfaces, which will then allow the possibility of interacting directly with the bodily senses, and maybe directly stimulating areas responsible, say, for hunger or thirst or taste or touch or proprioception, that doesn't rely on the body. Actually, to the extent that bodily senses in VR rely on your actual body going through all these things, then it's always going to be somewhat limited if it has to rely on the physical body. So I think ultimately if there's a path forward here, it's got to be somehow directly interacting with bodily representations in the brain. I presume that's how it works in the matrix, right? They jack in directly to bodily representations and simulations of the body. And I think this probably does interact with what you think about embodied cognition. If you think the actual body is absolutely crucial to cognition, then you might think that merely manipulating the brain is never going to get us there. And we're going to have to somehow use the actual body inside VR, which is going to create complications. If you're the kind of theorist who thinks that what matters is bodily representations, which I guess is the side that I fall on to some extent, although not to say the actual body is unimportant, then maybe it's going to be a matter of interacting with, maybe there'll be a path forward by interacting with bodily representations. But this does, of course, there's also the whole embodied mind and extended mind. And I want to say that the body can play a crucial role there, but I guess I'd like to say that digital bodies can to some extent play that crucial role too.
We've got quite a few questions in the chat. I want to ask Gustavo. To maybe I can just simply say that from the last contributions that the first question came from Andre, who's in Delft, who's a professor in Delft, and then Victoria's question. She's a graduate of Pratt and an architect, I think now based in Texas. I want to ask Gustavo if he could ask his question. I don't know if you want to ask it in person, Gustavo. Gustavo is now a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara. Shall I just read it out, or do you want to ask it, Gustavo?
Oh no, sure. I'll read it. Thank you, David, for the wonderful lecture. I mean, my question is just wanting to get your take on how you see the current role of scientific progress and research driving to this kind of unification of virtualization of the body. And it seems as though, to build on the ocular reference, are you looking at the current progress in cinema or immersive spaces and how you conceive this new future, speculative future that you're imagining? So for instance, cave technology, or like in Industrial Light and Magic, they have these curved screens where they virtualize characters to, I think, go into with real characters. Like, how do you see all of those progressions in technology and embodiment in your vision of the future?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just such an amazing, rich ecosystem right now. People thinking about virtual realities from the perspective of science, from the perspective of technology and engineering, from the perspective of the arts, from the perspective of psychology and medicine, from the presumably from the perspective of finance, from the perspective of the military. Yeah, it's just so rich right now. So yeah, I try and keep up with bits of it, but of course there's so much going on now that it's more than any one person can keep up with. On the science side, I guess I'm especially, because of my roots in thinking about the human mind, I'm especially interested in the kind of the psychology of virtual reality and the way people experience virtual reality. So psychologists like Mel Slater at Barcelona, who's done great psychological work on the sense of presence and what he calls all the illusions that VR give you, the place illusion, plausibility illusion. I've got some arguments with him about just how to describe that, but the cognitive science of virtual reality is very rich. And of course, the technology, I mean, right now, the biggest limiting factors seem to be technological in terms of things like getting the optics right, getting the power right, getting the light fields right, not to mention limitations tied to AI. But I try to keep in touch with the technology. On the whole art side of VR for art, immersive movies, and so on, I've actually probably done a little bit less to keep up with that than I I could have done. I mean, I certainly have. I like to go through these immersive experiences and movies and so on when they come available. And I have been inside. I've been inside one of those cave systems where they use the cave around you, very reminiscently of Plato's cave, to serve as the embodiment of VR. But it's probably been a couple of years actually since I was last. The pandemic has made some of these things harder, so I'm sure there's amazing things going on that side that I'm not keeping up with.
Sorry, David. I think what I wanted to be, I guess, specific is that I work in one of these instruments called the Alisphere at UCSB, and Neil has visited, and we're basically immersed in data. And a lot of what we do is we're making this virtualized instrument to explore the limits of what a human being can embody in data. So it could go down to the level of an atom. It can go down to this material that you could actually see. So it extends your imagination and instincts further. So I think, and now being in this instrument and in this research lab for over 10 years, I go, wow, I see the world differently. And it goes beyond the game, or it goes beyond the narrative. And then I come to you and I go, wow, how are humans evolving with all these different types of technologies? And how do you see them come to a society that is equitable or not in your future?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the Alisphere webpage. It looks amazing. So basically, I guess this is the ultimate project is data. I mean, the near-term project is data visualization and using VR technologies for amazing immersive forms of data visualization. I guess I'd see this as an amazing extension of the mind, by making data vivid to us. It's kind of providing ways for us to think about the data in a way that we just simply could not without that external aid. Maybe there are some people who are just magic at visualizing data using their brain alone, the likes of a Feynman or an Einstein or someone. But for most of us, we need this kind of mind extension technology. So I think of what this Alisphere is doing is roughly, I think it's basically imagination, imagery and imagination extension technology in the aid of what do you call data processing technology. So that falls right. So I think that falls right in, especially I think augmented and virtual reality can extend the world. They can extend the mind, but I think of this particular research project is especially tied into that intelligence augmentation, mind extending philosophical worldview. What does this mean in the long run? Oh my God, that's just a huge issue. And how is society going to deal with this? How is society going to already, where smartphones and the internet are extending our mind very, very deeply. Once we're all wearing the augmented reality glasses that give us access to that range of mind extension at every moment. I don't know if you read the Charles Stross novel Accelerando, where everybody wears these glasses around, and one day the guy's glasses are stolen and he's reduced to a whimpering wreck. It's like, oh my God, I can't do anything. I can't do anything anymore without my mind extending technology. So I mean, the ethical and legal issues and social issues are just massive. And the same goes for extending the world and virtual reality technology. I mentioned some of the reasons already. So I don't have any simple answer. I mean, I don't think there's a single one ethical, social, political issues here. I think there's a million of them, and we have to think about all of them. But I don't think there's easy answers.
Thank you very much.
You've got the cream of the AI world here, actually, in architecture. So I want to ask a question that Daniel Bolojan has asked in the chat. Daniel, I would say, is probably the leader in terms of AI in architecture. He both works for Corp Hillblau, kind of Zaha Hadid kind of practice based in Austria, very progressive on developing the most sophisticated model of AI for architecture so far, I think. Also, he's a professor at Florida Atlantic University. So this is a question from Daniel Bolojan. Thank you, David, for an amazing lecture. Question: according to neuroscientists, vision occupies about 1/3 of the cortex of the brain. Simply by opening your eyes and scanning the room, you activate billions of neurons and trillions of synapses. This is quite startling because when we think about vision at all, we think of it in terms of a camera. It simply captures objective reality as is. There is a part of vision that's like a camera, but that doesn't explain the billions of neurons, the trillions of synapses that are engaged in vision. Neuroscientists believe that these neurons and synapses that get fired up are creating in real time all the shapes, objects, colors, and emotions that we see. It feels that we are taking a snapshot of a room, but in fact, we construct everything that we see. We don't construct the whole world at once. We construct what we need in the moment. According to this, we are constructing and reconstructing a kind of simulation of ourselves. I'm wondering if you subscribe to this idea described by neuroscience. Are we building ourselves the simulation as we go? That's a great question, Daniel. Thank you.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, vision is amazing, and yeah, a huge amount of what's going into these visual computations is building up representations of the world, very rich representations of the world that go far beyond anything you can directly read off, let's say, a retinal stimulation. It's this massive inference. Yeah, this goes, I mean, in the history of philosophy, this goes back, this view is especially strongly associated with Kant, who said that, yeah, we basically, there's the world of things in itself and the world of appearances, and the world of appearances is to some very large extent constructed by the mind. And these days, you know, the modern analogs of Kant, I guess, well, there's any number of top-down theorists, but the dominant view is the Bayesian view, where it's yeah, basically your prior probabilities and your prior expectations. The brain has some complex theory of models involving these prior probabilities, etc. When it gets inputs, it then updates on them in this very complex Bayesian way to put forward these big hypotheses about the world. So I definitely agree this is building a complex representation of the world and a complex model of the world in this top-down, bottom-up way. The only question, I guess, is whether to call it a simulation. Think of, you know, simulations go beyond just representations of the world in the sense that you can play them in this direction, you can play them in that direction. You can say, what if this happens? What if this happens? And so on, and simulate many different paths, kind of dynamically, counterfactually. I think that's super important to simulation technology, and we do have that capacity in the brain and in cognition. I mean, most obviously in imagination, which is a form of running simulations. But I do think it's an open question to what extent that capacity is involved in ordinary vision. Does ordinary vision require building like that kind of full-scale imagination, imaginary model, full-scale model that can evolve in this direction or in that direction, or is it more of a simple representation? Because not every representation is what I would count as, say, a simulation that kind of, you know, that holds the whole of reality potentially independently evolving in itself. I mean, I suspect that what's going to happen is that once we really understand vision, there are going to be lots of little simulations playing some role in our visual models of the world, but the full-scale visual model may have elements that go beyond simulation. So I wouldn't want to just identify our model of the visual world with a simulation in this sense, but I do suspect that there are going to be elements of that.
I think the reason why I was actually thinking about it as simulation, I was just thinking about the fact that once I close my eyes, the entire world, in a way, disappears. I just have a gray screen in front of me. You know, I don't see anything. You know? I have to have my vision on in a way for me to start to see that world in a way, or create that world in a way.
I guess to me that shows you have a visual representation of the world, you have a visual experience of the world. But yeah, but the very fact that it goes away when you close your eyes, that to me suggests, okay, that what the brain is doing here is not really autonomous, say, from the inputs coming in. One strong version of the simulation idea would be, okay, well, inputs affect this, but even without the inputs, we'd have this giant world model. But actually what happens when we close our eyes, once we lose the visual inputs, we still have a world model left, but it's nowhere near as rich as the one we had with the eyes open. So that suggests, to me at least, that the brain isn't exactly running a fully rich autonomous simulation. Maybe it's providing the bare bones for such a representation, but the role of the inputs is so important here that that to some extent, to me at least, goes beyond the idea that the brain is constructing a simulation. It's like, yeah, the brain and the world are constructing a simulation, if you like, but that's that's a somewhat different idea.
Thank you, David.
Did I just say that in the background there you can see maybe I'll show you a video before we finish, David, so you can see the kind of stuff. But this is an hallucinated building that in the background of Daniel's thing that it was generated using style GANs and a bunch of different techniques. So I won't attempt to explain it, but I'll maybe show you it later in a second. I also we've got mentioned all the world's leading experts on AI and architecture here. There's Wanyu He, who is actually the leading developer of AI software, I would say, based in Shenzhen in China, also a DDES candidate at FIU. Wanyu, I'll read out her question for you. When Meta or other technology is trying to play the god, what is the potential problem you think they are facing? And how can we as the humans avoid being lost in such a utopia?
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, there's so many. So what are the properties of a god? They create the world. They're all-powerful. They're all-knowing. They're all good. They're all wise. Okay, so the corporations that create our world may not be all good or all wise, but they are, at least with respect to the virtual worlds they create, they can be, in principle, all-powerful and all-knowing. And I guess this brings with it, such obvious ethical issues. I mean, the fact that they're potentially all-knowing about these virtual worlds, the privacy issues are just massive. That, should some corporation have some knowledge of all of your actions and interactions in a virtual world? I think obviously not. But then how do you control that when all this is created and run by the corporations? Likewise, for being all-powerful, that basically corresponds to the issue of manipulation. In these virtual worlds, are we going to be constantly manipulated? If the corporations control these worlds, are we going to be constantly manipulated in ways that are to the advantage of the corporations rather than to the advantage of us? Whether it's, advertising or just constantly nudging us in certain directions where we may feel like we're making autonomous choices, but we're not. So I guess privacy and manipulation are two big ones. More generally, I kind of just worry about the whole fact that all this is set up by a corporation. It gives the corporations a kind of responsibility for everything that happens in the world. I've actually talked a bit to some people from Meta about this in their community group. They're really interested in setting up communities in the metaverse which are going to be benign and which work as well as possible. They're not trying to be an evil empire, but there's this basic fact that when you create the world, the environment, you are responsible for it. Should corporations be, even if the world they create is no better or worse than, say, a physical world, the fact that this has all been put in place by a corporation gives them some responsibility. And I'm not sure that any corporation should have that responsibility. So I don't know if it's going to be possible for there to be bottom-up, user-controlled, user-governed virtual worlds where no body is in the position of being responsible. So I just lost my.
That was a great answer.
Run out of gas. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay, let me just try something. Say something? Nope.
Yeah, it's a bit quiet, but we can. If you could put your volume on high, that'd be. But we can still hear.
1 second. What? Again. Let's see.
Neil, do you have any thoughts about what's transpired in conversation?
Well, I think that it's the beginning of a conversation. That's what I would say. Is that I think that what David has opened up is a whole series of incredibly important aesthetic and ethical issues that I think are going to reverberate through the world of architecture. So I just see this as the beginning of a discussion that's going to go on, and it's developed now, that's going to inform architecture, and it's really at the heart of many architectural kind of questions. David, are you back online?
Sorry about that. I think my headphones just lost power.
Okay, no problem.
Very good. No, I'm plugged in.
I want to just, there's a question also from Ji Shen, who is from Shanghai in China, but she's now doing a PhD in Amsterdam, and she is a philosopher, or doing a PhD in philosophy, working on AI. So I'll just read out Ji Shen's question. Thank you very much for the presentation. A lot of compliments about your presentation. I'm interested in the assumption underlying the embodiment of consciousness. There is an assumption that technology is the condition for humans to access the world, since the externalization of internal ideas into outside material forms of objects allows humans to create tools to make social progress. However, nowadays it seems that digital technology guides us in the reverse way. We probably don't need to externalize internal ideas to material forms. Instead, our minds are still in another non-physical world. Would you like to know? I would like to know what you think of this. Was that clear? It's actually in the chat if you wanted to just check it.
There's an assumption that technology is the condition for humans to access the world. This is part of you mean in the extended mind thesis? Since the externalization of internal ideas into material forms allows humans to create tools, but now we don't need to externalize internal ideas to material forms. I guess, yeah, it does seem right that now it's the technology which is dominant now. Yeah, I mean, before the computer came along, all of our technologies were non-digital, and the tools that extended the mind were non-digital physical tools. Whereas these days, it seems that role has so much been taken by digital tools, and our even in the extended mind, our main example was a notebook. Pens and paper in a notebook. We feel so naive right now. Of course, these days, your main example would be a smartphone or augmented reality. So we externalize into digital tools. Is this what you mean by no longer externalizing into material forms, but into a non-physical world? Is that we're externalizing into a digital world?
Yeah, I think is that my key question is that how we can take actions in the physical world. So because nowadays we just need to think and process in a visual world to using our digital technologies like computer science, artificial to how to say, mimic some kind of object, for example, a virtual world in our mind and in the computers. But what about the real actions we take in the physical world? So for example, we want to live a better life, we'll create a metaverse. But what about our physical world? We still need to materialize our mind into the physical world, which still hold as a foundation of our physical life. So yeah. I just think, yeah, it's like how we can really take actions, because this will lead me to think sometimes like, I just need to live in this metaverse or visual world. I don't need to care so much about my physical world. Yeah, it's really about like how I can materialize my ideas into physical real action.
Yeah, I guess there's this idea sometimes if we're interacting with a digital world or a virtual world, this will somehow alienate us from the physical world, and we'll no longer be able to act properly within the physical world. I certainly hope that's not the case. You know, one of the major uses of all this technology is for us to actually act better within the physical world when digital technology is extending our minds. I mean, I don't know. I know nothing at all about architecture, but I guess I would. My assumption is that working with tools that enable virtual worlds for an architect actually helps them to plan out actions within the physical world to help build a better physical world. I mean, very, very directly by connections between, say, virtual worlds and buildings and physical spaces. So I guess my hope was that actually for a group of architects that this would be so natural that extending our minds with virtual world technology is actually providing amazing tools for us to improve the physical world. And I guess maybe we could take that case of architecture and apply it across the board. And ultimately we are creatures, physical creatures in a physical world, and we have to act within those worlds. We also look, I think that virtual worlds are important too. And insofar as our actions taken within a virtual world can be equally meaningful, but nothing is there as to say that suddenly the physical world becomes meaningless. I think there's only one physical world here, and I would hope that these tools of mind extension offer all kinds of new possibilities. I mean, I don't know that I don't know the virtual world technology is going to suddenly solve the problem, say, of climate change and so on, but equally we shouldn't use the fact that there are virtual worlds to duck into virtual worlds and forget about the problem of climate change. That would be a disaster.
Thank you.
We have Emmanuel Coe here with a question also. You've actually got the everybody from AI and architecture. Emmanuel Coe, I think, wrote the first book in English on and maybe the first overall on AI and architecture. Wanyu He wrote the first book in Chinese and so on. But Emmanuel's question is, thanks, David, for the very interesting sharing. Emmanuel Coe is in Singapore, the Singapore University of Technology and Design. Current research in embodied AI has been considered as key to significantly moving AI research forward. Interestingly, simulation for these virtual agents is the very basis of much of this sort of work. You hinted on the possibility of not needing embodiment and that VR can indeed be genuine and meaningful. Might you be able to comment on this area of research in embodied AI? Is it the right direction?
Yeah, that's interesting. And it is interesting that so much work on embodiment in AI actually takes place with digital bodies or simulated bodies. I guess, robotics is really hard. Physical bodies, man, it's hard to deal with those. Much easier to deal with digital bodies or simulated bodies. But I think this kind of brings out the idea that, at least as I understand it, embodied cognition doesn't rest especially on biology or on physical bodies. The role of the body can be played by the physical body or by a digital body, and digital bodies can, in principle, extend the mind in the way that physical bodies can. So I guess I'd like to think that in principle, maybe not in the near term, but in principle, a digital body could have all the many just differently instantiate the functions of a physical body. And even in the short term, digital bodies can do much of the mind extension and mind embodying work of a physical body. I mean, in a fairly primitive way now, but I guess the kind of work that's going on in embodiment and AI, which I don't know all that well, but it is roughly the kind of thing I would expect, which is, it turns out you don't need a physical body to be embodied, and for embodiment to affect your cognition. Digital bodies can play that role just as well in principle, and maybe not yet in practice, but I take it that already in the context of AI, people are finding that you can do remarkable things there. So I think that fits quite well with the perspective. I guess we want to say you can have digital minds can be real. So far we had digital world can be real worlds, digital minds can be real minds, and maybe digital bodies can be real bodies. Why not?
We have
thanks, David.
Sorry.
I'm just thanks, David, for the sharing. So the embodied AI is really interesting. I think from an architectural point of view, because the context is very important for the simulation of these virtual agents, and therefore it brings architecture somehow, at least in terms of this environment, back to some sort of significance at least. And I'm asking the question also because much of the work kind of dwelled on simulating the physics, and all that, duplicating the physical. But if we are indeed kind of augmented or extended to the point that we could ignore this physical notion of habitation in space, then that is, I'm kind of find it quite interesting that perhaps embodied AI should also include other forms or other line of inquiries beyond a duplication of what we have here. Thanks.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. In general, why limit virtual worlds to copies of the physical world? Why limit virtual minds to copies of human minds? Why limit virtual bodies to bodies which are akin to human bodies, or even akin to human physics? I mean, if your purpose for dealing with digital bodies is ultimately to build some technology that will work with human bodies or in the physical world, then maybe the laws of physics become important constraints. But if your purpose is just to build an intelligence, an AI system, maybe a general intelligence, then yeah, there's no particular reason why general intelligence should restrict itself to human intelligence. And if embodied cognition is an in principle route to extending and augmenting intelligence, I would see there's no reason to restricting yourself to human bodies, to standard biological bodies, or even to bodies governed by the laws of physics. Maybe it's going to turn out there are worlds with different laws of physics, where there are amazing bodies that can do things that go beyond what anybody can do in this world. And if human bodies constrained by those laws of physics can augment or extend the mind, just think what these other bodies could do, not constrained by the laws of physics. So yeah, if it actually gets to the point where people think embodiment is a crucial element of driving intelligence, then I would think we absolutely need to be investigating, yeah, forms of digital embodiment that go beyond physical embodiment.
Miric is a PhD student in Shanghai, but she's actually in Serbia. Miric, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering about the extended mind theory and how, for example, when we use our phone, taking the example of Apple, everybody sees the same thing, searching for a phone number, and how this makes us all kind of having a similar extended mind, like different input, but similar representation of it. And then I was thinking about virtual reality, and I sort of simplified my question to ask, like, how can we differentiate when everything is running on the same program? But how can we truly be individual when there's the same digital bit behind it?
Yeah, interesting. Because I guess it's not a new thing that maybe our minds can be extended by some common elements. I mean, I think maybe in a community or in, I don't know, a classroom, some students listening to a teacher, and then that maybe Neil is part of all of our extended minds in virtue of these pellucid lectures he gives, and everyone now has got Neil as part of their extended mind, or a parent and a family and so on. So yeah, I think it's, in some sense, having common elements in an extended mind can actually join us together by giving us, in some sense, overlapping minds. Could my mind be part of your mind? Well, turns out Neil is a central part of us, part of both of our minds. And likewise, Apple, if we're both connected to the same resource on the internet, and that may be constituting my mind and your mind at once. I think, and you might think, okay, well, that's actually good because it provides some commonality and community. Now, if our whole minds ended up being constituted this way by say, Apple's version of the cloud, yeah, then there'd be very serious losses for individuality. But I guess I'm thinking that, at least with extended mind technology as it exists now, we all have very individual brains at the basis of this, with very individual personalities, backgrounds, goals, plans, and so on. And I don't think extended mind technologies so far in too much danger of threatening that. It maybe some parts of us get to be. I mean, I guess I don't know. It's true that many of my memories are stored now in I don't know, the Facebook image system or Apple's technology. If somehow Facebook chose to manipulate all this and gave us all uniform memories, next time we look everything back, then that would be a manipulation. That would be a disaster. But I think it just insofar as it's serving to enhance memory and other abilities, like as long as we have our individual brains and our individual consciousnesses behind this, then I would like to think this needn't threaten our individuality.
Thank you.
Manos Vermisso is a professor at Florida Atlantic University. He's also doing a PhD on AI. Manos, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Neil. Hi, David, and thank you for a very interesting discussion. So I had a question with regards, I think part of my question, there were tangents on other people's questions like Daniel's and Jishen's, which you already began to address, but I was thinking in the more general sense, until we're able to kind of gradually upload our brain, as you're mentioning in the book, and we, for the moment, let's say we have the potential to participate in the metaverse in a more traditional capacity via our, some kind of a headset or other technology, or even in a different way. I was trying to understand what are the prospects of the metaverse in terms of increasing our potential for creative decision making, because you mentioned that VR, AR interfaces can facilitate, for example, image recognition by replacing, the technology would actually do the recognition instead of ourselves. So I'm thinking this kind of overriding, do you think that may compromise our ability to imagine? And I'm asking this in light of some recent evidence that brain plasticity is actually demonstrated to have the ability to overcome serious mental trauma in patients who have undergone extensive brain surgery, indicating that this sort of brain localization of function is not as fixed as we thought,
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess, pretty much every kind of mind extending technology comes along, people worry that, is this going to compromise is going to degrade our original internal or biological abilities? So now that we look everything up on Google Maps, and has this damaged our ability to navigate with the brain alone? Do we have have our memory abilities gone down? Yeah, back in the old days, Plato railed against writing, saying people used to be able to remember things properly, and now they just externalize it, they write it down. It's like no one's really remembering the old tales like they used to. So I think there are always potential. If you stop using a certain skill, there's the potential of degrading it. I guess I think recognition and imagination are such central human functions, that I'd be surprised if kind of merely enhancing them in the way that AR is likely to do would degrade them too badly. I mean, for a start, so much visual recognition is automatic. Yeah, apple, banana. Okay, I don't need AR glasses to recognize an apple and a banana. And furthermore, if I was to move to a position where to recognize an apple, I'd have to read apple off a screen. Then that would just be a much more inefficient way to recognize apples than I do already. So I guess I'm thinking here that augmented reality recognition technology will help with the hard cases. Maybe we don't actually maybe people you haven't met before, or people you're forgetting, and so on. So it can extend your abilities in the hard cases. But I still think recognition is just so central to human perception that it's hard to see that would go away. And likewise, imagination has so many roles that, maybe, I don't know, is there a far future version of this where every last bit of our recognition is done through augmented reality or through brain-computer interfaces, where every last bit of our imagination is performed using mind-extending technology? I guess I'd start to worry at that point. This also connects to the previous question, that somehow at some point our individuality gets lost. But anything near term, I think, I guess I see human imagination and recognition as being so central to brain function that the internal capacities are not going to be threatened by being externally extended. You did mention also something about brain plasticity and mental trauma. I don't know if I addressed that part.
Yeah, the part that on one hand, perhaps we shouldn't be so worried because there has been recent proof that people who are, for example, tetraplegic with spinal cord injury and injury to a complete loss of vision in that part of the brain, were able to somehow relocate some of these sensory functions to other parts of the brain, even overlapping between left and right hemisphere, which was something that was not really accepted or known, to that degree until then. So I think it's, I agree with you that it's probably, the brain is much more mysterious than we expect it to be.
So how are you thinking of brain plasticity as connecting to these issues about recognition and imagination?
About the notion that if for example, our visual skills were somewhat compromised by not having to address, then our brain would adapt and cover in some
other bits of the brain could adapt. I see. Yeah, I guess I'm hoping that they wouldn't be so compromised. I think that if it turns out that those areas like inferior temporal cortex that seem to be very centrally involved in recognition of categories, if that would turn out to atrophy because our glasses were doing all the recognition for us, that would be a worry, and maybe that could be compensated by brain plasticity. But I'd much prefer that we didn't lose those capacities in the first place.
Thank you.
We have two questions, one from Aya Riyad and one from Rina Rodriguez das Neves. I don't know whether Aya, you ready to ask your question?
Yes, sure.
Great.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you so much, David, for this thought-provoking talk. A thought that just crossed my mind, and I would love to hear your comments on it, is the accessibility of this extended reality, because a lot of it is dependent on technologies such as these AR, VR headsets, which might not be accessible or affordable to everyone. So I wonder how, as these realities evolve, they turn out to be these quite exclusive human experiences that are eventually controlled by these tech companies. And I was just wondering how we as humans and how our minds could possibly develop and adapt differently as we progress in these new realms because of the different accessibilities available to different communities and societies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I guess we've found that, I mean, of course, all technologies end up being differentially accessible. I mean, once technologies become ubiquitous enough, on the other hand, they do seem to penetrate quite deeply. So the smartphone, I don't know exactly what the latest figures are on the use of smartphones in different communities around the world, but my sense is they've really penetrated very deeply. And it's easy to imagine a world where augmented reality technology becomes as ubiquitous as the smartphone, and that's something that everyone uses. Now, of course, there's going to be a situation where some people have better access or access to better technology and are maybe say 4 years ahead or something. If a latest iPhone comes first to the elites, but 4 years later, then everybody has it. And there's interesting political questions about, just say that's the situation. The elites are always 4 years ahead. How much is that a seriously problematic form of inequality, and how much of that is just a sort of a matter of degree and timing? I would certainly hope that virtual world and augmented world technology becomes very, very, very widely available. I mean, of course, there's still going to be relations of power and domination, and the people running these worlds are still going to have a kind of power over the people who are merely taking part in them, and especially with less resources, maybe people with heavy resources will be able to choose the virtual worlds which have maybe more privacy and more autonomy and less manipulation, whereas the people with fewer resources are getting the getting the technology somewhat later, and maybe if they want to get it for free, for example. I mean, a lot of stuff, digital technology does end up being available very cheaply, but of course there's always a price. They're going to be exploited, they're going to be manipulated, and so on. So I suspect that's going to be where a lot of the issues of differential accessibility hit the road. What kind of compromises to things like what you might have thought of as rights, like privacy and autonomy, end up being committed in the name of accessibility, and how to balance that trade-off. And yeah, of course, I don't have answers, but I think this is absolutely something we need to be thinking about.
Definitely, thank you.
That was actually a very good question. I would just say that in terms of accessibility, we've got people from all over the world here. Harith is in Baghdad, Iraq. We have also people from Bangladesh and so on. I want to draw upon, actually ask, well, I'll read it for you, but Marina Rodriguez das Neves, who's from Argentina and currently based in Miami. Her question is, well, first of all, she says, thank you so much for your presentation today. What role does the idea of projection play in your thesis? And what alternatives do we have to the perspective models in virtual reality?
Projection, you mean some projection into the world? So when, for example, an augmented reality, when you see a digital object in augmented reality, it's projected, it's represented out there in the world? It's super interesting. I don't think I give an explicit role to projection, but I guess it's probably there implicitly in a lot of this of these frameworks, where, I mean, in a certain sense, perception seems to, by its nature, be a kind of projection. We build these visual representations of the world around us, and experience projects it around us. VR does the same thing, just with computer-generated inputs, and augmented reality mixes the two. It produces inputs in a way so that we get to experience a world of both physical objects and digital objects projected among them. One analogy I use in the book is an analogy with the case of the mirror, of using mirrors. When you first use a mirror, it might look to you as if, there's someone there, through there on the other side of the mirror. You might think that's an illusion. You projected someone out there where they're not. But then after a while, when you're an expert with mirrors, you no longer really do that. Like when you look in the rearview mirror of your car, it doesn't seem like there's a car there through the mirror. It seems like there's a car behind you. You manage to locate the car appropriately in space behind you. Somehow your cognition has affected the way the object is projected into the world. And I think that can actually happen with virtual and augmented reality too, not least for classifying virtual objects as virtual, augmented objects as augmented. I think we have this sense of virtuality for virtual objects and a sense of physicality for physical objects, so that we somehow, I think, basically, at least as it stands now, I think we somehow perceive them differently. And this may have some connection to projection, but I need to think about exactly how that notion would fit in here.
There's several questions coming in from the live stream. Compliments here. I'm one of the early ones, Janine J. Label. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her name. Very inspiring talk. Might be a bit digressive, but I'm really keen to know your thoughts of life and death in the context of virtual reality. If virtual reality is the genuine reality. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. In one of the chapters of the book where I talk about VR potentially being meaningful, I say, well, what are some things that give life meaning that may not be present in VR, at least as it currently stands? And one is like nature. Maybe you don't get genuine nature because it's all artificial. But yeah, birth and death are also, you don't really get, no one is really born in VR as it stands now. Maybe in Matrix-like simulations of the future, people can be born there, but no, people have to be born in the physical world and then enter a virtual world. And no one really dies in a virtual world either. I mean, characters get banished, an avatar could even be killed perhaps, but the person doesn't die, they just leave, and the person could maybe re-enter with a new avatar. At the very least, that's a form of quick, resurrection or reincarnation. So it's not full-scale death. And you might think as a result that that's a sense in which life in VR is somewhat less weighty than life in physical reality, because birth and death are of course very meaningful elements of our lives. I mean, I think we'll still of course be born and die and in physical reality, and our lives in virtual reality will be given meaning in part by the fact that we were born and that we die. But it is a potential asymmetry. In the long term, of course, once perhaps we're uploaded to the simulation, then maybe there will be genuine birth there and possibly genuine death. But also, one of the prospects of digital uploading, of course, is to avoid death. That is to go for a world with possible immortality. Our brains will decay, but our their digital successors needn't decay. And yeah, that raises all the philosophical questions about the philosophical status of a world without death. Some people think that, I guess it was a thesis on the TV series The Good Place recently, that a world of immortality would gradually become meaningless. I'm not sure I accept that. I think that a world without death could offer potentially infinite possibilities and needn't be meaningless. But that is as the technology advances, some of these philosophical questions about the role of birth and death and giving meaning to our lives may become quite pressing.
I don't know if whether you are referring, Dave. You've got a lot of questions here. It's been a fantastically rich and provocative session. We've also got Patrick Schumacher here, who's the principal of Zaha Hadid Architects, so quite a significant player in the world of architecture. There's a question from Matt. Do you have time for a few more questions, or are you? How are you
Sure.
doing? Okay,
Sure.
Matt Gorbet, would you like to ask your second question?
Oh, right, sure. Yes, actually, this brings it back. Actually, it touches on a lot of what we've talked about already, but it's more bringing it back to the question of consciousness. That you've spoken and written a lot about consciousness and sort of the hard problem, which, if I understand it correctly, is sort of knowing what it is to be X, or understanding what does that actually mean to be something, or to know something, or not necessarily, sorry, not to know something, but to have the experience of something. I think, and I'm paraphrasing, I want some clarity on that.
People sometimes say knowing what it's like to be something. What is it like to be a bat?
Okay, so what is it like to be something?
Yeah.
Right. And so I guess my question comes from, if I can only know what it's like to be someone else through my own experiences and then what they say and what I can relate to, my question is, do you suppose that we might ever be able to experience the consciousness of someone else, and can VR play a role in that? Like, if it's all built on what I already know and what I've experienced in the past, so how can VR be a conduit here to better understanding that hard problem, or is it really just fundamentally out there?
Yeah, I think it could at least play a limited role in helping you to understand what it's like to be somebody else by, for example, putting you into their environment. In fact, many people talk about VR as an empathy machine. What is empathy? But, roughly taking the perspective of somebody else. And sometimes, people you can be put in the body of somebody with a different gender or a different race, and then come to maybe in a social world, come to experience some elements, at least some limited elements of what they experience, or you could be transported to a very different context. People are given different bodies. So that's to some extent helping you to understand what it's like to be somebody else. But of course, it's still you there experiencing it. Tom Nagel talked about doing this with the bat. It's like, okay, maybe we could get an environment where we're flying around and using sonar, but this would still be an experience of what it's like for me to be acting, in a bat's environment, rather than what it's like for the bat to be a bat. So to do that more seriously, I don't know what you have to do. Maybe in the extreme case, you transform your brain into their brain, and somehow, but of course, then are you even there anymore? Maybe a more limited case is to use the imagination. Maybe there'll be ways of finding so much plasticity in the imagination that we can figure out how to better and better imagine the conscious experience of somebody else beyond what we can do now. Get their whole experience. This is what it's like for them visually. This is like what it's like for them with respect to their body. This is what it's like in their thinking and imagination. And it's an open question to what extent, one person's brain will be able to mainline the processes of another. But I think it's as we come to understand imagination and empathy more and better, maybe then brain-computer interface technology will make it possible for other people to directly interface with. You can imagine eventually in some science fiction version of this, someone else's brain will interface with a computer representation that will come to us, that will then interface back with our brain and replicate what's going on for them in their perception, but for us in imagination. I mean, it's science fiction right now, but it's something we can dream of in the future.
Can I just ask you? Sorry, Matt. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Just, I mean, in terms of, do you ever use the expression post-human? I know that Andy doesn't like that expression post-human. He thinks we're fundamentally human and would reject that. It's all operating because of the plasticity of the brain. We still remain at the center. Do you ever accept the notion of the post-human, David?
I don't find myself using these terms, post-human, transhuman, partly because I'm just never quite sure what they mean and what's involved, but partly also because I don't really know what it would mean to be post-human. I don't know where to draw the boundary between humans and the things that come later. To me, to some extent, that just seems like a taxonomical question, or maybe even a semantic question. If there's some future uploaded version of us, just so we have new bodies, does that make us post-human? I don't know. I think it makes us humans with new bodies. Just say we have just say we upload ourselves to become digital beings. Does that make us post-humans, or does it just make us uploaded humans? I don't know. That seems somewhat semantic to me. I mean, maybe the AIs of the future, which are in no sense human, those could be post-humans, but I'm not sure that's what people mean by post-human. Anyway, it's not that I necessarily have an objection to the term, but I don't find them especially useful taxonomic terms myself.
No, that's a brilliant answer. Thanks. I also want to quickly, before we wrap up, because this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, David. It's really opened up a kind of Pandora's box of questions and a very interesting dialogue. I want to just show you, take the opportunity for you to see what architects have been doing. A couple of videos I want to show you, very short ones, to show you what they've been doing, just so you can see what's happening, as it were, out there. Let me first show you this, which is. Wanyu He asked you a question early on. She's developing a software AI software in Shenzhen. This was an early project. This building does not exist. It was kind of like based on the first hallucinations of buildings, kind of similar to this person does not exist website. And then this is the work that was kind of came out that Daniel Bolojan was directing for Corp Himmelblau, which is taking the whole kind of the data, all the previous buildings of this very progressive firm in Austria, in Vienna, and hallucinating other possible buildings. So I would say this is probably the state of the art right now. Things are changing rapidly, but you're kind of seeing what it is. And you have to actually, the trouble about these books that have been coming out, you can't see the animations and the videos, and this is really what is most intriguing about what is emerging. One of the challenges, of course, with this at the moment is it's still very much 2D. We still haven't got into the world of 3D. It's also very difficult to control. But nonetheless, I think it's something that's really, really hitting architecture in an important way. And I think those two models go together. The one of the AI for the office, which Wanyu was doing, which is actually going to increasingly take over the office, which has its own sort of a potentially negative input in the sense that as AI becomes more capable, we don't need so many architects and so on. And then there's more progressive stuff here. But there is an incredible, right now, I'd say this is the moment when AI architecture is opening up to AI. There are, I think, 5 books coming out in the next 4 months, all addressing this kind of question. So it's really an interesting sort of a point in time in terms of where we are. So
what should I read? What should I read for the state of the art right now?
My book? No. Well, actually, no.
Okay,
I've got a book that comes out. It doesn't have enough color pictures. It's called Architecture in the Age of AI: An Introduction to AI for Architects. There's one coming out in May. It's called Machine Hallucinations. Matthias Del Campo and I edited it, which is much more images, which is actually a nice compliment. But there's a manual code. He's also done a book. He's published. He's on this chat today, as is Wanyu He. Hers is in Chinese. but there are a bunch of them literally coming out. And I think this is really an interesting moment because, I mean, Patrick Schumacher is here actually on the discussion, and we had, about 3 years ago, we put in a proposal for the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and we got nowhere. We got nowhere, and despite the fact we were teaming up with Google and Zaha Hadid Architects, the leading practice. And now, in the time since then, and now things have reversed. There's absolutely an incredible interest in this domain. I don't know whether Patrick's got any questions, whether he wants to ask anything. He's here with us. Or indeed whether there are any other questions. I'll just read one out comment from Marissa Bell-Barrett, who's a PhD student in Georgia Tech. A fascinating and thought-provoking session. Pandora's box indeed, thank you. There are many compliments coming in from the chat. So I'm not sure, Patrick, are you here? Oh, I'm not sure if he's going to hear.
Yeah, no, I'm here. Look, sorry, I missed the presentation, but I've downloaded the book already and the audio, so I will go in there and I looked at some of the headlines. So I'm fascinated because we're fully invested in the developing of virtual worlds versus, but not as gaming and escape forms of life, but really a full-on extension and part of society and social life processes, productive processes, B2B, social communication, productive social communication. And so it's fascinating. And I think there's going to be a partial substitution of a physical environment by virtual environment. And it has a lot of fantastic implications. And initially, it's very closely tied to analogies with real spaces of interaction, because it's a lot to do with this communicative interaction framing through spaces, and a little bit like the internet was initially, computer working on the desktop analogy, then the web, first web iterations based on the magazine. Now we have the web, based on the analogy of the city. So I'm fascinated by this, but I do foresee in the further iteration a lot of capacity enhancements, and I do believe that we as humans, post-human inverted commas, we will have expansions of our horizons of interaction possibilities as these virtual worlds become more extensions of our navigational capacities, of our information processing capacities, 3D diagrams, and so on. And so I do have with a sense of plasticity of our perceptual and reasoning capacities and the tool-based expansions, mind expansions, which we've observed across the centuries and in recent times. So I find it exciting, and I was just wanted to throw that in there, and I've been very keen to read your book, and it's a shame I came too late to the session. But if just to think about it, we once had the Cyborg lecture series I contributed, and I find it fascinating how we can process new inputs. Like we can see with our tongue or with a grid of dots on the back. We can have visual image processing. So these kind of are hints for having an information-rich and interaction-rich environment, which with new forms of stimulation. So I'm curious on a cognitive science projection basis whether it will be truly empowering.
Fantastic. I'm seeing lots of points of convergence here between philosophy, AI, architecture, cognitive science. Yeah, this is a very rich field you guys have got yourself into. Patrick's
background is actually in philosophy, so he's good at that anyway. I just one thing I'll raise up on top of what Patrick was saying is that there is a concept that we have in architecture called the digital twin. Now that's being used increasingly. An example of this would be in China. There's a company called City Brain, where they have a kind of real-time monitoring of the actual city and use AI to try and alleviate kind of questions about traffic and to try and identify accidents and to control the traffic lights so you can get emergency vehicles there and so on. So that is a really interesting sort of concept. And what's happening now is that people are using the metaverse to test out scenarios and literally to design, using virtual agents to think through the kind of architecture that might fit certain spatial practices. So it's and that's something that's actually Wanyu's working on, and I think also under Patrick, Daniel Bolojan's working on it. So it's a big area to use AI as a kind of a digital twin. We're now, I think it's time to really wrap this up. David, thank you. This has been incredible, really, and so useful, because I think it's unpacked many of the book itself is really hugely accessible and readable, and I think it's going to be, I'm convinced it's going to be a bestseller among architects. It certainly should be, because we need to think through this realm that we're operating in, and this is really giving us the tools for that. So I kind of think that you literally, one of the comments in the box in our chat was, you have opened a Pandora's box full of questions. I think this is kind of like we're coming to the end of the session, but this is really the beginning of a dialogue, which I hope that you could be part of in some way in terms of the world of architecture. We had Andy come to our Digital Futures conference when we had physical conferences in Shanghai, and I think that your work you've got a real audience out there, which is going to be so grateful for this intervention. Fantastic session, really wonderful. Can I thank you for your generosity, and thank you also for the book. I mean, it's really useful. I don't know whether you've got any final thoughts, David, or anyone else, but let me just throw that out there. Yes. Do you want to say something, David, about?
I just want to thank you and thank everybody. Thank everybody so much for this great conversation. Yeah, I still haven't thought that deeply about architecture, but it's just amazing to have the sense that there are so many of these issues get replicated and come up so centrally in this domain. So I am looking forward to exploring the area more deeply, and maybe reading some things here and there, and continuing the conversation. And it's wonderful to know that these ideas can take on a new life in new communities. And so this has been eye-opening for me. So thanks so much, Neil, for putting this together, and to the rest of you for all your great discussion.
It's been eye-opening for us as well. So, I just want to thank you for this, and also to say that just in terms of everyone else that's here, that we're going to, next week, we're having Joscha Bach, and then Ben Bratton, then Jeff Hawkins, and Susan Schneider, who is in your book as well, and also Antonio Damasio. So it's going to be a really, really interesting kind of question. Thank you, David, so much, and thank you for your generosity, and thank you above all for your book. I recommend everybody go out and buy it now. It's really a fantastic book, so wonderful. So, David, to be continued, and thank you again. Thank you.
Fantastic. Cheers, everyone.